На вас смотрят все народы Европы, временно подпавшие под иго немецкой тирании, как на своих освободителей. Великая освободительная миссия выпала на вашу долю. Будьте же достойны.
It's the 18th of December 1878, and in a small town named Gori in the Georgian region of the Russian Empire, a boy is born who would someday become absolute ruler of the USSR. Josef Stalin's father worked as a shoemaker, creating footwear for the Russian army, while his mother worked as a washerwoman, which means she washed clothes for wealthier individuals living in the town of Gori. Stalin was the third of 4 children and belonged to a family which, even by late 1800s Georgian standards, lived in poverty. Stalin's father was a heavy drinker who'd spent years being physically abusive to him and his mother, and the drinking problem ultimately destroyed his shoemaking business, sending the family into deeper poverty. At the age of 6, Stalin contracted smallpox, which left permanent scars on him, and these scars would often be retouched in later state-released photographs of him as Russia's leader. At the wish of his mother, in 1888, Stalin began attending the Gori church school in order to have a formal education within Georgian Orthodox traditions, and because his mother wanted him to become a priest. Upon joining the church school at age 10, Stalin, who had been raised speaking Georgian, began learning how to speak Russian, a required syllabus for church schools to provide, and people with a fluent Russian mother tongue could tell you that Stalin spoke with a subtle Georgian accent. At the age of 12, Stalin was hit by a horse-drawn carriage, resulting in a lifelong injury in his left arm. Despite the hardships, he excelled in his literature and religion-based studies at the church school, and at age 15 he began attending the Tiflis Theological Seminary, where he worked towards becoming a priest. It was at the seminary that his ideas would begin to shift. At this time, in around 1894, the Russian Empire was still controlled by the Tsarist royal family, which bled into what Stalin was allowed to study at the seminary, which had very strict rules about the books and literature students were allowed to read. His naturally rebellious nature, combined with curiosity, led him to begin reading these banned literatures, the most notorious of which were written by German philosopher Karl Marx. Growing up in poverty and having his learning dictated by the Russian state meant that reading these banned books served as a form of empowerment for Stalin himself. Many of the ideas he incorporated during this phase of his life catered to the mistreatment of the poor through exploitation from the rich. During a phase of his life where he felt nobody stood up for him or his struggles, the banned literatures he read, which were deemed terroristic propaganda by the Tsarist state, became obsession. By his late teenage years, he had totally abandoned becoming a priest and was now part of underground Marxist circles in Georgia with the intent of contributing towards a revolutionary movement against the Tsarist state. During these years between 1899 and 1901, he would participate in illegal meetings and distribute illegal pamphlets or newspapers to workers and students, and he'd also help organise small-scale work strikes. Then in 1901, Stalin became a member of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, or RSDLP, which had been created in 1898 with the goal of uniting those with Marxist ideas all across the Russian Empire. In 1902, Stalin was arrested for petty criminal activities that were carried out to help fund the Georgian revolutionary movements he was a part of within the RSDLP. As a result of the arrest, he was sent to exile in Siberia by the Tsarist authorities. Then 1903 came. Stalin at this point was still a relatively unknown member of Marxist circles, and whilst he was still in exile, the RSDLP, who he'd become increasingly associated with, would go under significant change. There had been a series of disputes within the party regarding who was entitled to become a member, and the RSDLP ultimately split into 2 new groups, the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. The Mensheviks were led by RSDLP member Julius Martov, who had advocated towards allowing sympathizers of Tsarist Russia and other people besides full-time Russian revolutionaries into the RSDLP. The Bolsheviks were led by Vladimir Lenin, who completely disagreed with letting Tsarist sympathizers in and was only interested in working with people who took the goals of creating a socialist state absolutely seriously. This event became known as the Second Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party and had been heavily pushed by Lenin himself, who felt since the RSDLP had been created 5 years ago, had had far too many unserious or delusional members join. Stalin escaped his first exile in 1904 and returned to discover the split of the RSDLP. He gravitated towards Lenin and the Bolsheviks, who were fighting for an immediate working class revolution and wanted to avoid a stage of Russian capitalism. The Bolsheviks were willing to use violence against the Tsarist state far more than the Mensheviks were, and Stalin agreed with Lenin's view of skipping a potential era of Russian capitalism and demanding an immediate socialist revolution as a stepping stone towards communism. In February of 1904, about a month after Stalin had escaped his first exile and returned to Tiflis to continue his work as a now Bolshevik activist, the Tsarist state itself began eyeing up ports in East Asia, mainly in the Manchuria region of the Chinese Qing dynasty. Tsarist Russia had previously leased Port Arthur from China in 1898 and were beginning to have more influence over Manchuria and Korea. Japan demanded that Russia stop interfering with Korea and stop sending troops to Manchuria. Russia refused to do either, and on February 8, 1904, Japan attacked the Russians at Port Arthur, which sparked the beginning of the Russo-Japan War. Meanwhile, back in Russia, on the 22nd of January 1905, an Orthodox priest called Father Georgy Gapon had led thousands of workers and their families in a peaceful protest to the Winter Palace in Petrograd, now known as St. Petersburg. The plan was to present a petition to the Tsar himself, asking for better working conditions, fair wages, an 8-hour workday, and freedom of speech. Unfortunately, when they arrived at the palace, the imperial troops of Tsarist Russia opened fire on the large crowd of unarmed people, and hundreds were killed. This massacre directly contradicted the image Tsar Nicholas II had tried to maintain, as a leader who deeply cared for his people. The backlash was significant and ultimately led to the failed Russian Revolution of 1905, a disorganized attempt to pressure the Tsarist state through work strikes, riots, and protests, which were organized all across the Russian Empire. This unrest continued throughout the year, and by September 1905, Russia had suffered a humiliating defeat at the hands of Imperial Japan in East Asia, which further damaged the Tsar's image as an unstoppable ruler. During the failed 1905 revolution, workers across Russia had also established what they called the First Soviets, which simply means a council of workers, peasants, and soldiers. So it was clear as the year went on that the population of Russia was experiencing a significant mood shift. By October 1905, the resentment from these Soviets and the connections they'd built had become powerful enough for them to coordinate what is now known as the General Strike. What began with a Moscow railway strike in early October quickly expanded across the Russian Empire, and within days, Tsar Nicholas felt a crippling amount of pressure from these Soviets. This was without question the largest and most coordinated protest the Tsarist state had ever experienced at the time. Tsar Nicholas II wanted to use force to destroy this movement, but was heavily advised against doing so, particularly by political advisor Sergei Witt, who'd warned of the dangers in provoking the people more. While Nicholas II didn't like a lot of Sergei's more liberal views, he took the advice presented to him and opted not to escalate with more violence against the now established groups of Soviets. Tsar Nicholas II was then convinced to issue the October Manifesto on the 30th of October 1905, which promised greater civil liberties and something called the Duma, a national parliament involving elections. As 1905 came to an end, there was another uprising in Moscow, but many moderate Soviets had already partially accepted the Duma, and the movement had lost some support, leaving only stronger-willed Soviets behind whose defiance against the Tsarist state was crushed with brutality. And as 1906 came around, this movement against the Tsarist state slowly fizzled out. However, despite the 1905 revolution failing, it had succeeded in building stronger connections between workers, peasants, and soldiers, ultimately leading to the creation of a unified body called the Soviets. By April 1906, Tsar Nicholas II had made sure that the new Duma was presented to the citizens of Russia as a democratic government that would partner with the monarchy to rule Russia. But he'd also made sure that they had no real powers. In particular, the Tsar made sure he could dissolve the Duma at any given point, which resulted in 4 Dumas between 1905 and 1917. So now we turn our attention back to Josef Stalin, who in April 1906 was 27 years old. For the next 6 years until 1912, Stalin's life wouldn't really change much. He remained an active member of the Bolshevik faction of the RSDLP. He helped organize work strikes and demonstrations in the Georgian region of the Russian Empire. He continued to distribute Bolshevik propaganda, and he married a lady in 1906, only to lose her to typhus in 1907, leaving him absolutely devastated. He was also exiled 4 times during these 6 years, in a constant and extremely volatile lifestyle that saw him supporting the Bolshevik movement, being arrested, being sent to exile, and escaping exile. By 1912, Stalin had deepened his roots in Russia's Bolshevik scene. This brings us to a man called Roman Malinovsky, who in 1912 was also a heavily active Bolshevik and a colleague of Stalin. However, he was a secret spy for the Okhrana, the Tsarist secret police. It's important to remember by this point in the story that the Bolsheviks had certainly grown in size and influence, but still very much existed in the shadows of the Tsarist regime, which considered them an extremist organization that threatened the monarchy. Roman Malinovsky's job for the Okhrana involved identifying key Bolshevik organizers, providing the locations of secret meetings, presenting plans to the Okhrana of the Bolshevik strikes, uprisings and propaganda operations, and providing information about higher profile members, including Stalin, who had previously been exiled for involvement in Bolshevik activities. In May of 1912, Stalin was attending a secret Bolshevik meeting, and Roman Malinovsky was present. Malinovsky then provided key information to the Okhrana about Stalin's revolutionary activities that emphasized his role as an organizer as well as his previous escapes from exile. Josef Stalin was arrested and exiled to the village of Kureka, an exile location that the Okhrana used to enforce tough punishment. This was an extremely remote rural village in Siberia, with limited food, very basic shelter, and temperatures reaching -40 degrees Celsius in the winter. On a personal level, this affected Stalin heavily. He was already a man who struggled with trusting others, and having a fellow colleague who had smiled in his face before being the informer responsible for his arrest and exile would indeed shape his views about trusting absolutely nobody, not even those within your inner circle. While Stalin was exiled to Kureka, a Bosnian Serb nationalist by the name of Gavrilo Princip assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary on the 28th of June 1914. When Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia for the assassination of the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Tsar Nicholas II declared war on Austria-Hungary as a show of support for Serbia. Days later, Germany declared war on Russia in a display of support towards Austria-Hungary, and ultimately the people of Russia ended up being dragged into World War I. To put it simply, Russia was ill-prepared to fight the industrialized powers of Germany and Austria-Hungary. As Tsar Nicholas kept pumping resources into the war effort, Russia's economy and quality of life struggled badly. In February of 1917, the previously established and well-connected groups of Soviets in Russia reached a breaking point, and combined with the loss of support the Tsar had from his own inner circle, Tsar Nicholas II was forced to abdicate his throne on the 15th of March 1917 after weeks of protesting, an event which is now known as the February Revolution. And I hear you asking, why is it called the February Revolution if it happened in March? Well, to put it simply, today we use the Gregorian calendar, but until 1918, Russia used the Julian calendar, which is 13 days behind the Gregorian calendar we use today. And just to be clear, every single date I've provided in this video is for the Gregorian calendar. So if you look up any of the events I've explained up until 1918, there's a chance you'll be told a different date. Anyway, when the February Revolution happened and the Tsarist regime came to an end, Joseph Stalin was still in exile. Vladimir Lenin was also in Switzerland at the time, having fled there to avoid Tsarist repression after World War I had started, because the Tsarist regime viewed his political activities as a major threat towards the much needed unity of Russia in the war effort. Then we move on to a man called Leon Trotsky, who despite being a Menshevik when the Tsarist regime was toppled, was seen as a great ally by Vladimir Lenin. This might seem unusual because it was Lenin himself who wanted those he considered unsuitable to go off and form the Mensheviks. But Trotsky had a great reputation among socialist circles and had demonstrated fantastic capabilities in unifying people into mass movements through his speeches and writing. Not only was this an incredibly valuable skill set to Lenin, who was still yet to establish a socialist state, but the level of charisma and charm Trotsky had with the masses was simply something Lenin's other followers, Stalin included, didn't have. And so just as Stalin and Lenin weren't present in the February Revolution, Trotsky wasn't either. and was actually living in the Bronx in New York City when this happened, because if he'd gone back to Russia before the February Revolution, the Okhrana would have arrested him. With the February Revolution having resulted in the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II, the powers Nicholas once held were handed over to the Duma. Remember, the Duma was created by Nicholas to help relax tensions in 1905 by convincing Russians that they had some sort of a say in what the country did. But Nicholas, of course, had made sure that the Duma had no real authority. So when Nicholas was forced to abdicate, the power vacuum that followed was dealt with by an organisation that had very little, if any, experience. In a desperate attempt to prevent Russia falling into anarchy, the Duma created something called the Provisional Government. This was done over a couple of days, so to say the process was rushed would be an understatement. The Provisional Government also issued political amnesties for political prisoners, and an amnesty is defined as a pardon for people convicted of political offences. For Josef Stalin, this meant that roughly a week after the Tsar abdicated, he was freed from exile by the Provisional Government. He embarked on a long journey back to Petrograd and upon arrival, continued his involvement in Bolshevik activities. In early April of 1917, Vladimir Lenin returned to Petrograd from Switzerland. He immediately began organising meetings with the Bolsheviks to push for a second revolution against the Provisional Government, who he deemed totally unsuitable to lead Russia. Josef Stalin by this time was certainly well known within the Bolshevik Party, but his role was more laid back and organisational. One of his jobs over the coming months was to work for the Pravda, the official newspaper of the Bolshevik Party, which served as a revolutionary propaganda tool. It spread Marxist ideas, reported political events, mobilized workers and soldiers, and coordinated Bolshevik strategy, especially during the 1917 revolutionary period in Petrograd. As the months rolled by, the Provisional Government led by Prince George Lvov and later Alexander Kerensky decided to honour Russia's obligation to its allies in World War I. This was a very unpopular decision among Russian citizens, and created fertile ground for workers, peasants and soldiers who felt alienated by the Provisional Government to support the Bolshevik movement that promised peace, land and bread. By mid-April of 1917, Vladimir Lenin was facing difficulties with two of the Bolsheviks' senior leaders, Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, who disagreed with Lenin's stance that seizing power was urgent. Despite this, Lenin was widely respected and managed to convince the wider Bolshevik party to follow through with his plans for a second revolution against the preliminary government. Leon Trotsky organised the Military Revolutionary Committee of the Bolshevik Party, ready to coordinate a takeover when Lenin gave the green flag. Lenin knew that Trotsky was a gifted commander, and by 1917 Trotsky had become chairman of the Petrograd Soviet, giving him influence over the city's soldiers and workers. Trotsky's next moves involved coordinating a group known as the Red Guards, who were a voluntary militia made up of people who supported the Bolsheviks and their struggle for a socialist state. As Lenin and Trotsky took control of the situation, Stalin played a background role, maintaining communication between Bolshevik leaders and helping coordinate party activities. On the night of the 6th to the 7th of November 1917, or the 24th to the 25th of October 1917 on the Julian calendar, the October Revolution was launched by the Bolsheviks under Vladimir Lenin. The Winter Palace in Petrograd was surrounded, and the Provisional Government leaders were arrested with minimal bloodshed. The All-Russian Congress of Soviets met shortly afterwards, and despite playing a minor role in the background, Josef Stalin was present. At this meeting, Vladimir Lenin declared that all power had been passed to the Soviets of workers, soldiers and peasants, which effectively meant that all power had been passed to the Bolsheviks, since they were the ones who controlled the Soviets across the country. While the coup was successful and Lenin had dismantled the Provisional Government, the Bolsheviks by this stage had simply established control over Petrograd and Moscow, not Russia as a whole. Let's now turn our attention back to Josef Stalin, a Bolshevik who by this point in the story was working in the shadows of Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky. Lenin at this time viewed Stalin as a loyal man of action, but still had doubts about his capabilities, and chose to appoint Trotsky, Zinoviev and Kamenev in far more senior roles within the Bolshevik Party than Stalin. And truthfully, these three men looked down at Stalin. They were all from well-educated and far more privileged backgrounds than him, and Trotsky himself was openly dismissive of Stalin, both in personal interactions and how he wrote about him. What these three men were doing was heavily underestimating Stalin and taking him for far more of a fool than he really was. By early 1918, while all of this was going on within the party, anti-Bolshevik forces had formed across Russia to oppose Lenin's desire for a fully socialist state, calling themselves Whites, because white symbolized the now fallen Tsarist monarchy. In the name of creating a fully socialist state, Lenin once again appointed experienced commander Leon Trotsky in charge of the Bolshevik army, the Reds. This event became known as the Russian Civil War and lasted nearly 5 years. During those 5 years, the White Army was supported by the UK, France, US, Japan, Italy, and Canada. Japan's support of the Whites might seem strange given the war they had recently fought against Tsarist Russia, but they viewed the Bolsheviks, who wanted a global revolution, as a far bigger threat. Despite international support for the White Army, the Bolsheviks held Moscow and Petrograd, controlling vast amounts of factories, railways, and telegraph lines. In July of 1918, the Bolsheviks decided that the Tsar needed to be executed to destroy the White Army's most potent symbol of legitimacy. Tsar Nicholas was taken to Ipatiev House along with his wife, children, and servants, where they were all executed in the basement by firing squad. Meanwhile, under Leon Trotsky, the Red Army was disciplined and used former Tsarist soldiers who were all well trained. Furthermore, Bolshevik propaganda pushed the narrative that the Whites were trying to resurrect the old oppressive regime, and ultimately the Red Army existed under a unified goal, while the White Army was fragmented, with a mixture of different opinions and ideologies. The year 1918 had also seen the Bolsheviks change their name to the Russian Communist Party, to emphasize their commitment towards Marxist ideology. Then in 1919, during the height of the Civil War, the now Russian Communist Party under Vladimir Lenin established the permanent Politburo, something that they'd had in the works since the October Revolution of 1917. The party had faced difficulties with foreign intervention, the economy, and internal rebellion, with the pre-existing Central Committee of the now Communist Party struggling to respond quickly enough to these issues. As a result, the Politburo, which consisted of 5 trusted leaders, Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, Kamenev, and Krastinsky, was created to speed up decision-making in the now very active Civil War. By late 1922, the major White armies had been defeated by the Red Army. An organisation called the Cheka had also embarked on an event now known as the Red Terror, an act of mass oppression that saw tens or hundreds of thousands of people executed, who the now Communist Party deemed a threat to their revolution. The majority of the Red Terror took place during the Civil War itself, but it remained an active tool once the White armies had lost. By 1923, the Communist Party had consolidated total power over all of Russia, and had previously established the final name of the land in December of 1922. Vladimir Lenin had declared it the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republic, also known as the USSR. But while the Red Army had succeeded in establishing the now permanent communist state of the USSR, Vladimir Lenin had suffered several strokes, and by 1923 he had very severe health problems, which affected his ability to speak or move. Back in April of 1922, it became clear that the Red Army had won the revolution, and the Communist Party no longer needed a military-focused government. It had also grown massively over the Civil War, and now had millions of members. This led to the Central Committee of the Communist Party assigning new roles to members, Stalin included. On the 3rd of April 1922, Josef Stalin was given a role, titled General Secretary of the Bolshevik Party, which of course by the end of that year had become the Communist Party. Lenin had made sure when these roles were assigned that Trotsky, Kamenev and Zinoviev had more influence and power over the party than Stalin, at least in his eyes. He saw the role of General Secretary that Stalin was given as a way to involve him without allowing what he saw as the unsophisticated and ruthless techniques employed by Stalin to dominate a more senior role. Stalin viewed this role as extremely low status, especially considering his long-term loyalty and commitment to both Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks. But as it would turn out, the General Secretary role given to him that expected him to manage day-to-day organisation of the party, keep membership records, and complete other administrative tasks, would actually provide Joseph Stalin with a huge amount of leverage that he would go on to use to become absolute ruler of the USSR. The key reason why General Secretary wielded far more power than Lenin initially believed was because it gave Stalin control of recruitment for the Communist Party. When Stalin realised this, he began leveraging the position to carefully select who was eligible to join the Communist Party and who wasn't. Over time, Stalin used this role to place loyal supporters of his own into key positions, which slowly built up a network of loyal and compliant followers of Stalin within the Communist Party. As time went on, party meetings would take place. Trotsky and Zinoviev were both very gifted public speakers and would give speeches to the party, only for Stalin and his less gifted public speaking to stand up and give his opinion, before a large group of Stalin's network who felt grateful towards Stalin voted in favour of what he wanted. By the time the more senior members of the Communist Party realised what Stalin was doing, it was too late. As Lenin fell deeper into illness, Stalin made sure to visit him and report on party matters. But these visits catered to Stalin's personal agenda, making sure he was seen in photographs with Lenin. These visits were very frequent, and Lenin's wife eventually asked Stalin to visit less often, because she knew Lenin didn't have long left and wanted the stress of politics kept out of his final months. Stalin reacted very angrily to this, and reserved the right to visit Lenin as often as he liked. Lenin was deeply upset by Stalin's treatment of his wife, and was also well aware of Stalin's use of the role as General Secretary to obtain power within the Communist Party. As he began realising he didn't have much longer left to live, Vladimir Lenin wrote his last testament. The testament expressed concerns about Stalin's power-hungry nature, and Lenin even suggested removing Stalin as General Secretary of the Communist Party. On the 21st of January 1924, Vladimir Lenin died at the age of 53. His testament was handed over to the Central Committee of the Communist Party and privately read among its members. 6 days after he passed, Lenin's funeral was held at the Red Square in Moscow. It was widely accepted within the party that Leon Trotsky was Lenin's natural successor, and Stalin wanted to ensure Trotsky did not become leader of the USSR. In an act designed to damage Trotsky's public image, Stalin, who served as a key organizer in Lenin's funeral, made sure that Trotsky was given the wrong date. The funeral was a massive public event that gave Stalin the opportunity to make his first major public appearance. Furthermore, as the key organizer of the funeral thanks to his role as General Secretary, Stalin was able to decide who had the opportunity to speak publicly and who didn't. In the end, Stalin was able to use the funeral as a major tool to boost his public image as a devoted and loyal comrade of Vladimir Lenin, and had succeeded in becoming the most prominent figure present at Lenin's funeral in the eyes of the public. Furthermore, when Leon Trotsky arrived late to the funeral as a result of Stalin giving him the wrong date, his image within the party as well as among the public was damaged badly, with many viewing his excuse as a poor one. After the funeral, the Communist Party now had to decide whether or not Lenin's testament would go public, especially because of Lenin's emphasis of Stalin's power-hungry nature. Privately, Leon Trotsky did support publishing the testament, but he feared accusations of disloyalty and Stalin's ever-growing influence. Zinoviev and Kamenev, however, had both been criticized in Lenin's testament, albeit to a far lesser degree than Stalin had, and so they both voted to keep the testament out of public domain. Realizing that weakening Trotsky was his first move towards absolute power, Josef Stalin formed an alliance with Kamenev and Zinoviev in an attempt to isolate Trotsky. There was also a power vacuum within the party because the USSR was still under the collective leadership of the Politburo. Kamenev and Zinoviev were worried about Leon Trotsky. While Trotsky's public image was damaged because of his lateness to Lenin's funeral, he was still seen by many as a hero for winning the civil war, and both of these men feared he would exploit the vacuum and take power for himself. In the process of forming an alliance with Kamenev and Zinoviev, combined with his already existing network of loyal followers, Joseph Stalin was able to keep his role as General Secretary and heavily reduce Trotsky's influence over the Communist Party. By 1925, Leon Trotsky had been sidelined from the party, which simply means he was excluded from any real decision-making or influence. After this happened, the Politburo was still the governing force of the Communist Party of the USSR, but Stalin was slowly tightening his grip over total domination. Over the next 1 to 2 years, Stalin continued to control party appointments and build a loyal following through his role as General Secretary. And in 1926, Trotsky, Kamenev and Zinoviev joined forces in what is now known as the United Opposition, after Kamenev and Zinoviev realized Stalin's alliance with them served only Stalin. The three men desperately tried to expose Stalin and mobilize support within the Central Committee of the Communist Party, but it was too little too late. The following Josef Stalin had cultivated, resulting in his ever-growing influence over the Central Committee, meant that he could easily counter their rebellion through claims that they were trying to divide the party. On the 15th of December 1927, an event known as the 15th Party Congress was held, having been arranged by Stalin and his allies within the Central Committee of the Communist Party. With the intention to resolve the disputes raised by the united opposition, the Congress resulted in Leon Trotsky, Lev Kamenev, and Grigory Zinoviev being expelled from the Communist Party's leadership. Once this happened, Josef Stalin had solidified himself as the most powerful man in the Communist Party, and by extension, the USSR. In the years that followed, Stalin continued to tighten his grip of power by further removing people he considered a threat, such as Nikolai Bukharin. Leon Trotsky was exiled from the USSR in 1929, forbidden from ever returning. In the years that followed, he lived in several countries and moved to Mexico City in 1937, and on the 20th of August 1940, he was killed by a Spanish communist and NKVD agent of Stalin's with an ice pick. Meanwhile, Kamenev and Zinoviev had been internally exiled within the USSR and were arrested by the NKVD after spending the past 7 years fulfilling very minimal roles within the Communist Party. At the trial of 16 in August 1936, both men were found guilty of treason for their previous collaborations with Leon Trotsky and were executed by firing squad the same month. In the years that followed the 15th Party Congress of 1927, that saw Trotsky, Kamenev and Zinoviev expelled from their leadership positions within the Communist Party, Stalin's ever-growing power had essentially solidified him as absolute ruler of the USSR by 1929. And he would go on to commit a series of atrocities that involved gulag forced labour camps, mass executions, and a man-made famine in Ukraine, which resulted in the starvation of millions, after Stalin's collectivization policies forced wealthier peasants known as kulaks to hand over the majority of their harvest to the state. He would also later form a non-aggression pact in 1939 with then dictator of Germany Adolf Hitler, who would break this agreement in 1941 by launching Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in human history. While the USSR succeeded in defending the motherland, it ultimately saw more than 20 million Russians killed in the Second World War, and in 1953, at the age of 74, Stalin died from a severe stroke after nearly 25 years of absolute rule.